This episode is brought to you by ARX. You want to be a successful strength training studio owner. The problem is you aren't able to deliver the safest, most efficient and effective workouts, making it harder for you to attract and retain clients, which makes you feel frustrated. I understand that it can be difficult to differentiate your business without the right tools. ARX's breakthrough adaptive resistance technology uses patented motorized resistance and computer software to give you and your clients the perfect workout every single time. BioFit founder John Zarbok says that ARX is clearly the superior tool to deliver the exercise stimulus. My clients are seeing insane improvements in weeks, not months. I could not fathom running my business without ARX. So here's how you get started. Number one, go to arxfit.com/HOB to get $500 off your ARX machines. Number two, book a call with the ARX sales team. And number three, learn how ARX can help you grow your strength training business. Go to arxfit.com/HOB so you can stop struggling to attract and retain clients and start to grow your strength training business with confidence. Lawrence Snell here, and welcome back to highintensitybusiness.com, the podcast where we discuss high-intensity strength training and provide you with the tools, the tactics, and strategies to help you grow your strength training business. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know that over on the blog post for this episode, you can download a free PDF called How to Attract Great Personal Trainers to Your Strength Training Business, which is obviously a big need that I've identified in our industry. And you can find that over at highintensitybusiness.com if you search for episode 350. Furthermore, are you struggling to grow your strength training business? If so, join HIT Business Membership, where we provide how-to guides from successful studio owners, a monthly virtual happy hour with experts like Dr. James Fisher, who occasionally comes, Q&As, forum community, private coaching from me, and lots more resources to help you grow your strength training business with confidence. You can join over at highintensitybusiness.com/membership. Today is episode 350. And the topic of today's episode is a research paper called Resistance Training Recommendations to Maximize Muscle Hypertrophy in an Athletic Population, position stand of the IUSCA. Me and Dr. James Fisher are going to be running through this paper, but we're going to spend most of our time on the consensus, or in fact, like 99% of our time on the consensus recommendation put forward by this paper, which I think is probably most exciting to you watching or listening in terms of understanding the summary of the different resistance training variables and how to utilize them in the most effective way for your own training and the training of your clients if you're a personal trainer. Today's guest, as I've already mentioned, is exercise scientist Dr. James Fisher, who worked on the paper alongside the who's who in resistance training science. James, great to have you on the podcast again, mate.
Lawrence, thanks so much for having me back.
You're most welcome. I appreciate your time. So before we get into the consensus recommendation, do you just want to introduce this paper, like the why you wanted to work on it, who you worked on it with, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So going from the origins, Brad, obviously Dr. Brad Schoenfeld contacted me, far in advance of sort of writing the paper, and sort of said he's been approached by the IUSCA, which is the International Universities Strength and Conditioning Association. And he said he's been asked to write a sort of a consensus statement of recommendations. And he's approached a number of authors, and that the email, of course, had all the co-authors on it. And as you said, it's a who's who. I mean, you look down the list, certainly over the last 10, 20 years, Yozo Gergic and Cody Horn have been really significant. And then for a long time, Eric Helms and Stu Phillips, and of course, Brad and James Steele. And Andrew Vygotsky as well is a significant name in this field. So to be honest, the opportunity to work with those authors was really something I couldn't really pass up. As well as obviously the idea of putting together a consensus statement. I know a lot of people think Brad and I, fight on a lot of things and disagree on a lot of things. And we've spoken extensively. We've worked on a few projects together now. And I can tell you, and I'm sure Brad would agree, we agree on probably 99% of things. And it's really the sort of some of the smaller minutiae that we disagree on. And really that's down to sort of interpretation of limited research. It's not that we categorically disagree. It's maybe that we present things from different viewpoints, or that we both accept that there's limited research, and so we kind of are drawing maybe marginally different conclusions. So really, there was a great opportunity to work with these names, and yeah, I couldn't pass it up. So it was that was sort of the scene set. From there, Brad sort of had an idea of who he wanted to work on, what sort of sections, to basically write each section following a specific format, which was a really nice format. And let me be absolutely clear, Brad took the lead on this. He did all the editing of the final document, and of course reshared it around the authors and circulated it extensively for comments. And it's absolutely a consensus statement. So as we get into some of the smaller things that I maybe don't 100% agree with, it would be wrong of me to say I disagree with them. It would just be fair to say that I think that there's more of a question mark over some of the statements. So, but it's a fantastic piece, and Brad really spearheaded this, and I was really proud to be a part of it. So,
which sections did you work on then mainly?
So I wrote the section on advanced training methods.
Oh, cool.
Which is quite a long section because I like to speak.
No.
And obviously I've done a lot of that research with Discover Strength on pre-exhaustion and drop sets, breakdown sets, and so forth. And it's been, a huge interest of mine, a really, really sort of passionate area of my interest, and unfortunately lacks a lot of research on muscle growth rather than just strength increases. But yeah, so that was my piece, and James Steele had a piece, and Stu Phillips had a piece, and we all sort of then put it together as a jigsaw and then made it fit. And yeah, it was a really nice project.
Awesome. Yeah. And I think obviously, encourage the listeners and the viewers to actually go and download this paper. It's free online. You can just download the PDF. You just type the paper title into Google, you'll find it pretty easily, because we're going to be obviously going through the consensus recommendations about load, volume, frequency, rest interval, exercise selection, and set endpoint, and the various nuances of all of those. But there's still going to be some stuff we don't touch on. I mean, you've got great section in there on the relationship between strength and hypertrophy, and a lot more. So, and it's actually really interesting to hear that you all took on different sections, because that makes for quite an interesting read. So I encourage everyone to check out the full paper, but obviously today will be useful for those who just want to understand these variables we're talking about. So I think what's going to be interesting is trying to tame my high intensity training bias during this, because I definitely had a lot of that as I was reading it, and I'm thinking, okay, James is going to have to challenge me and put me in my place. And I know that we're all human, right? We all have our biases, as Dave Smith has taught me, and it's very difficult sometimes to look at things outside of that. I think we like to think we can, but it's hard, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think this is why this paper is so important, because myself and Brad and James Steele and maybe Cody and Eric and so forth all do come things from our own perspective, or our own research and our own interpretation of the research. And that's partly why a consensus statement is so important, because it's the ability to kind of concede the argument a little bit based on an overwhelming body of evidence. So Brad and I do disagree on some things, but Brad was, it was really gracious of Brad to invite me on, because he would surely expect me to kind of back some of his arguments a little bit, and of course he would do the same with me, and so forth. And that's a really important thing, that you get people. You don't surround yourself with yes people. You get people that challenge you and ask the questions that are difficult to answer. So I think that makes it a really nice piece.
Yeah, it's just healthier and more productive that way, right? Otherwise, you almost stall your learning and stagnate if you don't get challenged in that way. Awesome. Okay, so let's get straight into this consensus recommendation. So we'll just go in the order of the paper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read each line out, and then we'll just discuss it, right, if needed. Some of it's probably relatively self-explanatory, and maybe there's not much dispute to be had. But the first section is load, right? And the first bullet is individuals can achieve comparable muscle hypertrophy across a wide spectrum of loading zones. And I just wanted you to elaborate on that so people understand what that means.
Yeah, so you jump straight into the program variables. There's a couple of areas that precede that, if I might.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
The paper actually has a couple of areas about the relationship between hypertrophy and strength. And of course, this is recommendations to maximize hypertrophy. And this is something we had to be really clear on. It's about the minutiae of the gains, the smallest gains that are possible for strength athletes or power athletes or size athletes or figure competitors or bodybuilders and so forth. So for the people that are looking for an efficient workout, which is typically the HIIT community, I know that there'll be a lot of pushback against that. But I also know that a lot of the HIIT community are interested in optimizing muscle size. So I think
the majority, no?
Well, yeah. So I think that there's lots to be said in there. But there's an early section which is really interesting read on the relationship between strength and hypertrophy, and it kind of summarizes a lot of Jeremy Linecki's work on the relationship between strength adaptation and hypertrophy adaptation. And one of the things that's been highlighted there is that one can occur without the other. So we can increase strength without size gains, and we can increase muscle size without necessarily increasing strength. And I think that's a really nice read, because most people in the high intensity community have often felt like you have to increase strength to then increase size, and one doesn't exist without the other. So I would really encourage people to spend some time on that section. From there, they might go back to Jeremy Linecki's work and look at it. But I think it's really interesting. And one of the things we don't get into a huge amount of detail there is how size can increase strength, but also how we measure muscle size. So if we measure at a myofibrillar level, so at the very smallest level, we might see changes that aren't necessarily appreciable in a whole muscle cross-sectional area, and hence why we can see strength increases without muscle size increases. So because we're measuring the whole muscle, we don't see a size increase, but there might be other structural morphological adaptations that are occurring that are causing a strength adaptation. And I actually did a session on this at a rec conference many years ago, and if anybody's interested, I can probably share the old slides. It's quite a nice area to discuss. And then the second area that before we get into the program variables was an area that Stu Phillips wrote on acute versus longitudinal data, and it really talked about muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown and protein recommendations and so forth. And again, I think that's a really important area. To take all the training variables on their own is great, but if we don't appreciate what adaptations might be occurring, or if we don't appreciate the other ways that we can optimize hypertrophy, we could be disillusioned if we don't see adaptations, or we could be failing to maximize our adaptations if we aren't consuming maybe sufficient protein or rest or so forth. So those are two of the key sections that are really worth reading. Getting back to your question, apologies.
No, is there anything else? I was going to ask you if there's anything else you think we need to touch on before we go into the consensus recommendation and make sense of it all.
No, not necessarily. I think if we talk about briefly the relationship between strength and hypertrophy, one of the key things that I always say is people who are looking to maximize hypertrophy often get disheartened when they don't look in the mirror and see an increase in muscle size and cross-sectional area. And one of the key things that I think is interesting is that we aren't really clear on the relationship between an anthropometric measurement of muscle size, so using an ultrasound or an MRI, and what we see in the mirror. It might be that an ultrasound does identify a growth, but when we look in the mirror, we don't see that growth. The old adage of the best way to look bigger is to lose 10 pounds of fat. Of course, that makes you look much more muscular, it makes your muscles look much more defined, and it makes you look bigger. But actually, you probably added no muscle, you just lost body fat. So I think there's a lot to be said about our perceptions and maybe the ability to be disheartened if we're following a protocol that doesn't seem to produce results. So our understanding of how adaptations occur can be really important. And then the other section by Stu was, making sure we have adequate kind of protein into our diet, which I think most people in this field are quite clued in. And this is an area that's a little bit of a tangent in this paper because it's not necessarily a training recommendation. But I think that if we don't consider our nutrition, within context of our training, we're probably missing a trick. Doing all the right training is great, but if we're not eating well, and of course resting well and sleeping well, we're probably not going to maximize our adaptations. So
yeah, there's not much I can do about those last two for myself, unfortunately. Sleeping. And what's Dr. Phillips's protein recommendations? 1.6 grams per kilo.
So Stu and Brad wrote a paper a few years back, and they sort of said that the
super high level,
the government guidelines are very, very low, and they even went as far as to say to absolutely optimize. There's some studies showing as high as 2.6 grams per kilo, but the recommendation from this paper was 0.35 to 0.5 grams per kilo per meal, which, to put it in context, for an 80 kilo male, which is myself, that's about 40 grams of protein per meal. So, and then of course you would extrapolate that over the day to maybe 160 or 200 grams, depending on whether you're at the 2 grams per kilo per day or 2.2 or 2.6, whatever it might be. One of the main things that's come out in this area over the last sort of decade, or more clearly over the last decade, is that the idea of having too much protein being very bad for our kidneys has really been debunked. You know, that there's just no data to support that. So for people to exceed recommendations is probably far safer than to have too little. And ironically, this is a kind of a case of science has finally proven what people know. You know, bodybuilders, anecdotally have been saying for decades about having huge volumes of protein and it not being bad for them. And finally, science has supported them. So
I'm having flashbacks of that Brazilian restaurant we were in Southampton years ago,
absolutely.
Where I never seen someone eat so much meat in one sitting yourself. And I thought I had a big appetite. And I just remember, like, we could barely talk because it's one of those restaurants where they constantly come around to your table and give you more meat off like a skewer, don't they? And you were like, yeah, I'll take that. I'm like, this guy's going to be asleep in like an hour.
Yeah. James and I, we often take our PhD students there, and anybody who comes to visit, yourself or Simon or Luke, we've taken there, I think. And it's great. But James and Steele and I both sort of say after a meal, if it's anywhere after about 2:00, we then fast through the next day. You know. Yeah, it's that's plenty to kind of see me through for probably a good 24 hours.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's a good strategy. I've been using that strategy actually in order to try and mitigate fat gain during early parenting, and because I just find, I know we're going off tangent now, we'll get back on script soon, but I just find for me the stress and sleep deprivation leads to, and I guess everyone finds this, leads to stress eating, right? And
absolutely
cravings and things. So I find, and I remember you said to me in the States when we were at Rec, you were saying to me how when you're on holiday, one of the things you utilize is intermittent fasting, because you're not going to eat probably good foods. You're going to eat some processed food, some junk food here and there. And that's kind of one way you can kind of manage it, I suppose, or mitigate against, going too overboard, which I thought was clever. So I've been utilizing that heavily. Not sure it's working that well, but it's doing something. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, your question was about load.
Yes.
And this is a really nice sort of ease in. The first thing that's also worth saying is all the variables they're no good on their own. So we have to take load in context of volume, in context of frequency, and so on and so forth. So I think if we take any single variable on its own, we're probably missing the bigger picture. But that said, the statement around load was quite clear that you can use a variety of loads. We've kind of debunked both Brad with his co-authors and myself with my co-authors have published papers over the last couple of years, basically saying a hypertrophy zone doesn't really exist. And that really any load from about 40% of 1 RM upwards is good for hypertrophy. And the only real evidence to show that there is a lower limit is a study that looked at a load of 20% of 1 RM. And I can't imagine many people using a load that light. I think I would probably have boredom by failure before repetitions by failure if I was using 20% of 1 RM. But that said, I think even going down to 40% of 1 RM is a very, very light load. That's an incredibly high number of repetitions or time under load. And one of the things that we kind of say is that there's probably a fair argument to have a variety of loads used. Sometimes it's good to do heavy reps, sometimes it's good to do lighter reps, and so forth. So load is one that's nice. To put it in Tanner's, in Skylar's phrase, all roads lead to Rome.
Is it Skylar that started not coined that obviously, but started using that in this context?
He once said to me at a conference, it seems like when it comes to training, that as long as you get to failure, all roads lead to Rome. And I thought, you know what? I think you're absolutely right. It probably matters very little, or all the other variables are very, very secondary, as long as you are training at a high enough effort. So.
Yeah, I had a question around that actually. Yeah, I mean, just curious, is there also an issue, obviously, when you're training at very low loads, like 20% of 1 RM, that it's very difficult then to actually fatigue the full spectrum muscle fiber, and maybe some of the sort of slow twitch or that end of the fiber spectrum start to recover, and is that one of the problems there?
Yeah, it's quite possible. It's quite possible if a load is too light, if it's below a certain threshold, that our recovery of the slower twitch muscle fibers can occur and allow us to continue performing repetitions without ever reaching that high threshold, faster twitch motor unit recruitment. It's definitely all hypothetical. One of the things that we've talked about is the area of effort and discomfort. And when you do certainly a high number of repetitions or a high time in the load, or a high number of muscle actions, then you are accruing a high number of metabolites, which are causing a degree of discomfort, maybe arguably the burn in the muscle, which is sending feedback to say, you want to stop exercising soon. This is not very pleasant.
So let me ask you a follow-up question on that. So would that suggest then that if you did, because sometimes I prefer doing like a 210 cadence with a rep range of 6 to 8, with reaching failure there, load that will help me do that, versus 8 to 12, like a 2-4 8 to 12 rep range. And is that because there's less contraction, so there's less discomfort, basically? There's a longer negative as well, which is easier to tolerate.
Potentially, yeah. I mean, you could argue it's really interesting when people talk about accentuate the negative without exaggerating the eccentric load. I'm not really clear where I stand on accentuating the negative repetition duration. I think when you're at the end of a set, the idea of having a longer rep duration is great. So if you can't complete a repetition, or if it's the last rep that you can do, then maybe doing a 30-second negative is great. But, doing a 210 rep duration during that 10 seconds, you're effectively allowing a recovery to occur. So one of the things that I tend to do is I do the same rep duration eccentrically as I do concentrically. So if I did a 10-second eccentric, I would do a 10-second concentric. If I do a 4-second eccentric, I do a 4-second concentric, and so forth. So I tend to think that actually it's probably fair to slow down the concentric as well. We know that the eccentric isn't as metabolically taxing, so it doesn't do as much for the adaptation until maybe the end of the set. So a 210 probably would be nicer for a total time under load compared to maybe a 2-4 or a 4-4 or so.
That's interesting. But specifically, what about the contraction volumes? Because there's less contractions. Would it be more less discomfortable?
There's honestly, I can't answer that. There just isn't the data to answer that. One of the things that we do know is an isometric muscle action prevents kind of a flow of blood in and out of the muscle because of the edema within the muscle. So it presents kind of, so we know that an isometric can cause sort of considerable discomfort because the metabolites that we're producing aren't being pumped out by the dynamic movement per se. So by that argument, you might say, well, in that case, surely a slower muscle action would have a similar effect, but a slower muscle action still has the dynamic component, so still allows metabolites to move. Whereas actually a faster muscle action might recruit higher threshold motor units and therefore cause greater accumulation of metabolites, things like inorganic phosphate and hydrogen ions and so forth, which are potentially the parts that are produce discomfort within the muscle. So, but there really isn't the evidence to suggest what rep range or rep durations causes discomfort. There just isn't the data. So
that's so interesting. God, I could do a whole podcast on this alone.
It's fascinating. And the other end of that is that if we go too heavy, I mean, and when I say too heavy, I mean very close to 1 RM, we might be optimizing strength and muscle fiber recruitment, but we might not be incurring sufficient metabolic stress to stimulate growth. So and this is referring back to one of Jeremy Lernecki's papers, where he looked at a strength protocol, which was sort of 5 reps at a very, very heavy load compared to a typical sort of 3 or 4 sets of 8 to 12 reps. And the 5 sets of a very heavy load, they were 1 or 2 reps, didn't produce growth in the same way that the higher volume being number of repetitions, produced. So I think if we go too heavy into the 1 or 2 reps, we might again be tipping outside of a scale. So I know that this sounds contradictory to what I just said about a hypertrophy zone, but I guess a hypertrophy zone has been thought of as 60 to 80%. What we can probably say is a hypertrophy zone is probably more like 40 to 90%. And then a bit below it or a bit above it, we might be starting to taper the potential for adaptations.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Okay. So let's see here. There may be a practical benefit to prioritizing the use of moderate loads, the majority of sets. Practical benefit, you kind of already explained that, haven't you? So that meaning that it's just perhaps slightly more efficient, more less produces less discomfort than trying to train harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, excuse me. The next bullet here, last one in load. Preliminary evidence suggests a potential hypertrophic benefit to employing a combination of loading ranges. Okay, I know we covered some of this. This can be accomplished through a variety of approaches, varying repetition ranges with a session from set to set, implementing periodization strategies. Let me read this fully. Or by implementing periodization strategies with specific blocks devoted to training across different loading schemes. So that's where I wrote a note saying all roads lead to Rome. It's like you can vary this so much over a course of a training career that it doesn't really matter that much and you'll still get similar outcomes. Is that?
Yeah. And I mean, one of the things that we've said is something that this lends itself quite well to the planning / periodization section, which is at the end of the program variables. So we'll sort of touch on that a bit then, but it's not bad to jump into it now. And it's this idea that sort of variation is probably not a bad thing. I certainly wouldn't, if somebody said to me, I always use the same load. I'm, 43 years old. So my adaptations are probably very minimal. I've been training for a long time. So I effectively always do the same weight and get around about the same number of repetitions for the same rep duration. Is that bad? And my answer would be, no, it's not bad. It's not bad at all. You're absolutely fine. If they said, if I did that for 6 weeks and then for 6 weeks I used a bit lighter load and did a higher number of reps to failure, would that be bad? And I'd say, no, that wouldn't be bad either. Feel free to do that. In fact, the variation is probably quite nice and it's potentially good for you because now you're doing a higher number of reps, a higher number of muscle actions. You're telling the body it's a slightly different stimulus and so forth. And then they could go the other way. Instead of using, a weight that incurs failure in 8 to 12 reps, they now go to a 6 to 8 rep range. And they move from 90 seconds under tension to 60 seconds under tension. And I would say, no, I think that's great. And that's really what we're saying, that we can afford some variety in this training. There isn't necessarily evidence to say it's essential or to say that it optimizes adaptation, but there certainly isn't evidence to say that it doesn't optimize adaptation. And the idea that if we vary loads slightly, we vary the stimulus on the muscle and on the body metabolically, then that might sort of constantly keep the body challenged and stimulated to adapt. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. And on a personal note, for me, I know you always ask about different people's training programs. I never go in and do the same weight. You know, typically over a number of weeks, I would know what weight I'm using. But then I would occasionally go in there and go, actually, I'm going to do a bit lighter weight and higher number of reps, or I do a drop set, or I do a heavier weight and do rest pause, or do a heavy weight and do a drop set, whatever it might be. So,
yeah, I am definitely going to be using your own workouts as a reference during some of this. Because it helps paint a picture. I don't know that you just love talking about your training, James, but yeah, it's the other thing I got from this obviously is that, you know, we have as Luke once said to me, there's a broad umbrella of approaches we can take, and that's great for personal trainers out there who want to provide variety, excitement to clients for, you know, long-term retention, adherence to their training. So moving on to volume. Now, this is the one where my hip bias really started to affect me. So a dose of approximately 10 sets per muscle per week would seem to be a general minimum prescription to optimize hypertrophy, although some individuals may demonstrate a substantial hypertrophic response on somewhat lower volumes. So you and I have talked about this before. We've talked about it in the membership. We've probably talked about it on the podcast as well. Some of the concerns you had with that particular recommendation. So can you just elaborate on your views on that?
So there's a couple of approaches to this. First off, if we take it at absolute face value, the evidence, this is not incorrect. If anybody thinks that I'm disagreeing with this statement, they're wrong. I'm happy with that statement, and I stand by it, you know, as a co-author of the consensus statement. What I would say is the picture's a bit bigger than that. That's you know, painting a very narrow line. I think one of the things that we forget is how easily other muscles are trained during other exercises. So we've talked previously with Luke about program design, and we've talked about not doing certain exercises back to back because we know certain muscles are fatigued. And if you do, you know, we've talked about this, let's say, for example, the chest, and if you do a dumbbell pullover, the chest is quite significantly activated. If you do a skull crusher exercise with a barbell, I would say the deltoids and the chest is probably quite significantly activated. Obviously, an overhead press is going to activate the chest and so forth. So to say 10 sets per muscle per week, I think is quite within most people's HIIT protocols, whether they do a fewer number of exercises and train 3 times per week, or whether they do a large number of exercises and train twice a week. I would bet the most Discover Strength clients, and I'm using that as an example because I know, so I'm not saying that other programs don't do this. I would bet the most Discover Strength clients come pretty close or hit that target.
Can I interrupt you for 2 seconds?
Give or take a set.
Yeah. Let's talk about that for a second. Firstly, I mean, obviously, in the context of DS, they're not maximalists, even though they're probably stimulating like, I don't know. I mean, obviously, from the client's perspective, they're looking for the most efficient workout possible. I mean, that's the biggest selling point of what DS do and what most of us do in high intensity training business, right?
Of course.
But they're kind of, we're kind of smuggling in like this is probably optimal as well, like, but they're not, you know. So there is but there are certain instances, I guess, where we're programming for the absolute minimalist who wants, you know, minimum effective dose, nothing more. But so that's just one caveat. But just taking one step back, you said they're skull crushers. You reckon activate the chest or recruit the chest. We're talking tricep extensions, right? Same thing.
Yeah.
Are you really? Because whenever I do that, I just feel a ton of tension in the tricep. I can't.
Of course you do.
I can't say I feel any tension in the chest, and maybe I'd have to do it to really think about it. But
of course you do. And it would depend. I mean, it might vary if you did a cable skull crusher with a low cable compared to a barbell, compared to an easy bar. It might vary depending on your elbow position and your shoulder position. If you're on a decline bench and so forth. And it might vary dependent upon what exercises you've done to precede that. So I'm not saying that every exercise activates every muscle. Don't get me wrong. What I'm saying is I think that we probably undervalue the amount of musculature that's being activated to especially maybe stabilize a weight or control a weight. Now, the more machine-based exercises we do, potentially the less likely we are. So if you did, let's say, a tricep extension, a Nautilus tricep extension. Rick Rignell has a great Nautilus tricep extension where you sit, you have your arms up on a pad here, and you extend outwards. Arguably, that's probably not going to do a lot to activate the chest because of the position that you're at. But as soon as you go to a skull crusher exercise and you maybe stabilize the weight and you're pushing against it, there's probably a degree of kind of contraction here to maybe bring the elbows in. I mean, the pectorals don't press outwards. They serve to adduct towards the midline of the body. So if our elbows are flaring out and we're pulling them in, that's no different from a pec fly. Okay, so if you're having to work to keep your elbows in, that's your pecs activating. So now, to kind of wrap up the point, I simply think that there's a lot of exercises that activate a lot more muscle than we necessarily realize. So I don't think that HIIT people need to get so bogged down by the 10 sets. If they're I think they're probably closer to the 10 sets than they realize. If they do 2 sets of chest press in a week because they do an A and a B workout, or they train on a Monday and a Friday, I don't think they would say, well, I do 2 sets for my chest, because they might do a dumbbell fly, or they might do a pull-up or a pull-over or whatever it might be, which probably also, or an overhead press, which probably also has stimulus. So now the flip side of all this is of course optimization. So this is saying 10 sets. The other thing around all of this that I think is really worth highlighting, and I'm going to get you to go back a page. So if you skip back to page 8, they cite the meta-analysis, and they say, I'll read this out verbatim, a meta-analysis of 15 studies that compared higher to lower volumes found graded relative increases in muscular gains, 5.4%, 6.6%, and 9.8% when the number of sets per muscle group per week was stratified to less than 5, 5 to 9 sets, and greater than 10 sets per week, respectively. Okay, so you can't argue with that data. That's the data. That's what it is. That's fine. The thing that's worth clarifying here is that's relative data. It's given as a percentage. And relative data is always easy to misconstrue. Let me put that in perspective. If I took an ultrasound of your quadriceps and your quadriceps was 6 centimeters, which would be fair, that would be a change. The 5.4% would be a change from 6 centimeters to 6.3 centimeters. The 6.6% would be a change from 6 centimeters to 6.39 centimeters. And the 9.8% would be a change from 6 centimeters to 6.5 centimeters. So actually, whilst you can say 9.8% is almost double the 5.4% if you do 10 sets, what we're really talking about here is a difference from 6 centimeters to either 6.3 or 6.58. Yeah. So I think when we start to take absolute data, we can say, well, 3 millimeters is, it's growth. If that's what people are if that's the only thing people are interested in, you can't argue with it. But if people are saying, hey, I've got to do extra sets to get this extra millimeter or 2 millimeters of growth, which I'm probably never going to notice looking in the mirror, what are we really talking about here? So I think that I'm not, like I said, I'm not disagreeing with this. This is absolutely true. I stand by this. But when we start to look at a bigger picture and we look at absolute terms, not just relative terms, we can start to see, okay, to do these extra sets, I'm going to get an adaptation of extra 2 millimeters of growth.
Yeah, that's so well. What a great bit of schooling on absolute versus relative science. I think that's something that is so important to understand when reading science, right? And that was great. That was really clear. When you say it like that, yeah, it's great. It is basically meaningless. But you're not. I mean, you're just saying it exactly like it is. So
I also just to add to that final point, I also think the volume factor, and most of the HIIT community will probably already be screaming this, the volume factor is still really not clear in context of the effort factor. So most people will still argue, well, we're talking about multiple sets compared to a single set to failure, to true failure, blah blah blah. Has that ever really been tested? There's a lot of criticisms of the research, no matter what people's opinions are. So I think that as soon as we say 10 sets, we say, well, we're not talking about 10 sets of an exercise, and we're certainly not talking about 10 sets of an exercise to failure. So
yeah, well put. So that obviously affects things quite a bit. I just wanted to give an example, actually. I mean, I just want to entertain this for a moment. If we are seeking that 9.8%, we're obsessed with that relative 9.8%, right? Let me tell you, give you a workout plan, or maybe we'll just focus on a few muscle groups here. So let's say I tend to do, well, at the moment, I tend to work out once a week because I just simply do not have the energy to do twice a week, right? But let's say I did do twice a week, okay? I mean, in once a week, it's hard, right, to get 10 sets per muscle group. I mean, your workout has to be damn long, right, in order to fit that in.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking, for example, if you wanted 10 sets on biceps, you'd have to have a pull down in there, a seated row, a bicep curl. That's only 3. Right, so you need a 7 additional exercises that would use it in some way, whether it's as a stabilizer or a dynamic stabilizer or synergist or whatever,
Yeah, in a single workout, that'd be pretty tough.
Yeah.
But I mean, over two workouts per week, if you add in a 4th exercise, that even stimulates. Let's say you do, let's say you do a deadlift exercise. Well, deadlift arguably is going to put a lot of tension through the biceps. If you do a shrug exercise, anybody, I challenge anybody to do a shrug and not contract their biceps. So again, this is where I'm starting to talk about, if you do that twice a week, that's 8 sets of an exercise, so I think you're there or thereabouts. So
this is truly minutiae discussions.
The other thing that we can put in context here is when we talk about people that are looking to optimize muscle growth, let's arguably talk about bodybuilders for a second. Bodybuilders, typically very strong people lifting very heavy loads. Well, one of the things that I would never advocate is somebody going into the gym and lifting an incredibly heavy load without having done some preparation. So, I mean, and even if that's just a kind of a technical warm-up, let's say I go in the gym and I do squats. Let's say I'm incredibly strong and I go in the gym and I squat, let's say 300 kilos. So 300 kilos is, say, 600 pounds. So it's obviously a ridiculously heavy weight. Everybody knows I can't squat that. But I would never walk into the gym, load up a bar with 300 kilos and begin squatting. I'd be far more likely to go into the gym, load up the bar with 100 kilos and do a few reps, check my knees and my back feel good, then go up to maybe 200 kilos, then and so forth, and build up to that sort of maximal weight. So again, we're looking at people that are probably in a position to do that because of the incredible weight that they're lifting. Whereas, the reality is if I go into the gym and I do squats, it's probably with 100. I mean, I don't do squats, but let's arguably say I go in with 100 kilos. Well, what I might do is I might put a 20 either side of the bar. So that's a 60 kilo squat and do a few reps with that, and then put another 20 in, and there's my 100 kilos. But arguably, I've already done that. Arguably, that's already 2 sets of squats. So, so I think the volume.
Yeah, I forget these sets aren't taken to failure, are they? That's the thing I keep forgetting. Yeah. And you said there about the volume effort issue. And what I thought was also really interesting, and we'll move on to another bullet in a moment. I think we've probably covered a good amount of other bullets in this bullet, though. Is you make a really good argument for the value of free weight and body weight exercises, just the amount of additional muscle groups that are involved. And obviously there's trade-offs, right? So machines, especially if they're well designed, it can be very surgical, right? If you really want to contract a muscle and focus on a specific muscle, but there's benefits to free weight and body weight in terms of potentially, greater volumes across other muscle groups, right? So there's interest, something I hadn't really thought about before this, to be honest.
I mean, we'll touch on this as we get into exercise selection, and then it again comes back in the periodization section. But I definitely think there's an argument for some body weight movements. Yeah, I certainly would tell people that you will get, I mean, everybody here listening to this podcast must know the difference between a pull down and a pull up. In how fatiguing they are, in how, if I load up a bar, if I load up a plate loaded or a machine with my body weight, I will get more on a pull down than I will if I go to a pull up bar and I do pull ups. I will also on the pull up get more activation of my abdominals, potentially of my hips, potentially of my hamstrings if I'm having to bend my knees at the bottom. I was talking with James Steele earlier today, and we were saying one of our pet hates about dips is that because of the height of the bar that you tend to do dips at, you, at the end of a workout, get cramp in your hamstrings because you're bending your knees back, right? So everybody knows that you're getting, like, nobody does a dip and thinks they're getting a hamstring exercise. And yet when I do dips, I get cramp in my hamstrings. So there's contraction occurring. There's, so... But yeah, I definitely think there's a big argument for some body weight movements and for some, for the difference between open chain and closed kinetic chain movements and potentially free weights as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely going to jump on that a bit later, actually, because I want to explore that a bit more. Let's see here. Where are we? So moving on to the next bullet in volume. Evidence indicates, I'm going to read them out even if we've covered them, just so I can read them out and make sure we have covered them. Evidence indicates potential hypertrophic benefits to higher volumes, which may be of particular relevance to underdeveloped muscle groups. Okay, so actually this would be interesting to talk about briefly. Can you talk about why for underdeveloped muscle groups, why the higher volumes?
Yeah, so I think that if people are struggling with a muscle group, then there would be an argument for focusing on that muscle group, for maybe doing more for that muscle group to stimulate growth, to try and stimulate more damage to those muscle fibers. I think that we have to be really, really careful with that, because as you do more for a muscle group, you might need more rest and recovery.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
And I think the other thing is, I mean, I've known over the years, I can think of good friends of mine over the decades, one of which has, this sounds weird, but has great like pec development and lesser arm development. And the other one has great arm development and lesser pec development. And the reality is they've trained together probably for 20 years. So they've probably done the same workouts, unless one of them goes home and does a lot of like dumbbell flies and the other one goes home and does a lot of biceps and triceps, which is, obviously ridiculous. So I think our genetics, we like know
secret eaters, secret workouts.
Yeah, exactly. So we know people who are genetically predisposed to have a bigger chest or bigger arms or bigger quadriceps. And that might be because of their biomechanics. It might be because of the origins and insertions and the muscle belly size and so forth. So I think if somebody has let's call it a lagging body part, there's probably not a lot can be done for it, but there is certainly no harm to target that body part, maybe at the start of a workout when you're fresh, or to add a higher volume to it. As Luke Carlson would always say, I wouldn't consider myself having done a workout unless there's been a single joint biceps in it. So, some people will want to have that extra volume for a certain muscle group and so forth. So.
This episode is brought to you by ARX. These are the most intense exercise machines I've ever used. I remember how fast a pull-down exercise took me to muscular failure and beyond. On the final negative or eccentric excursion, my tank was practically empty, but the adaptive resistance enabled me to continue to perform work until the predetermined end of the set. This experience was very profound and made me realize how effective ARX is in helping clients reach a high level of intensity in their workouts and ultimately produce the best results. I also love how ARX measures and tracks range of motion, rep cadence, total output and time, and more with real-time audio and visual feedback. These features are powerful sales and retention tools to help you convert and keep more clients. As a listener of the High Intensity Business podcast, ARX is offering you $500 off your machines. Just go to arxfit.com/HIB to book a call with the ARX sales team to learn how ARX can revolutionize and grow your fitness business. Again, go to arxfit.com/HIB. And now back to the episode. Yeah. So does this kind of suggest then that a lot of the specialization routines you see, even in high intensity training, probably don't make any difference, but perhaps won't have much downside? So you know what I mean by that, right? Like the specialization routines, just to like where they just, okay, this is it's a full body workout, but it's got like a tricep emphasis or a bicep emphasis or whatever. Right. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think they'd have any negative implications at all, but I don't know to what extent they would have, great advantages over a more traditional workout. So.
Okay, cool. Awesome. James, this is turning into the greatest podcast of all time. Go on.
Sorry.
This is quickly turning into the greatest podcast of all time. Keep going. Don't let us down now.
I think the thing is that we as exercise scientists can only answer the questions that have been answered by science. And the problem is that the masses, the HIIT community, the bodybuilders, the personal trainers, the gym bro, have more questions than can be answered, and really are asking such questions into the minutiae that they're almost never really going to be answered, because of the time it takes to do the study and the money it takes to do the study and so forth. And also the sample size it would take to identify whether there is or isn't any difference. I know James Steele obviously blew your mind by talking about inter-individual variability. And I think the biggest difference is that if we know how small the difference is there is between somebody who trains versus somebody who doesn't train, then we know just how small the difference would be between two people that train but do very, very slightly different protocols. So I think it's just, some of these are just almost impossible to answer.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so although empirical evidence is lacking, there may be a benefit to periodizing volume to increase systematically over a training cycle. What's your take on that? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm honest, I don't recall there being any evidence to support that. But I think that if people are focused on the minutiae of hypertrophy, then increasing volume over a training cycle. So let's say they're over a 10-week cycle and they go over those 10 weeks, they increase the number of sets, let's say, in a total workout, or they increase the number of sets so much they move from a 2 to a 3-way split or whatever it might be, then, I think one of the key things, as soon as you add in periodization, is that the non-HIIT community also then start talking about deloading phases. So periods of training with a lighter load not to failure, or periods of not training at all, or periods of much lower volume, or so forth. So we in the HIIT community say that's not sustainable, because you just keep adding sets and keep adding sets, and you would never have enough recovery. Whereas in the HIIT community, we would probably never follow that guidance anyway. So it's a bit redundant. And actually the people that might follow that guidance are going to add in other periodized phases of deloads or recovery or so forth. So,
and I think, didn't you make the point once at a rec conference, might not been exactly about periodization, but that, is this not another potentially an all roads lead to Rome example, right? Where one group does it this way, the other group do it the other way, you both kind of get to the same place over enough time.
Yeah, periodizations are really, it's a really difficult area. Periodization itself is designed, and we're jumping ahead now, but periodization really is designed for two purposes. One is to have a single goal. So we talked previously about maybe sports performance, a single event like the Olympics or a competition, where you obviously wouldn't want to be overtrained for, you'd want to peak for that event. But periodization is also there to kind of prevent overreaching and overtraining. Well, again, when we talk about the high intensity community, we talk about such low volumes of training and probably such a low frequency of training that we're unlikely to reach overreaching and overtraining. But in fact, I think periodization is a bit. I mean, the great example is periodization. You know, people argue for periodization, say, oh, well, if you look at the best sprinters and the best American football players and the best soccer players and rugby players, they all use periodization. And everybody goes, oh gosh, well, we need to use periodization. Well, if you look at the worst soccer team and the worst American football team and the guy that didn't win the 100-meter sprint, the guy that finished 10th in the last 10 Olympics, he used periodization too. So are you following a protocol that the winner used, or are you following the protocol that the loser used?
Yeah.
So, you know, I think at that level, there's such small differences. So periodization, again, is a really difficult one to help people get around. Do we periodize? Don't we periodize? If you've got a specific event to periodize for, to plan for, you should plan for that event and kind of backtrack through your year and your training. Without that, I think train regularly, train hard, job done.
Yeah. Beautiful. And similar bullet here, it may be prudent to limit incremental increases in the number of sets for a given muscle group to 20% of an athlete's previous volume during a given training cycle over roughly 4 weeks, and then readjust accordingly. So we kind of treading over the same ground with this one, or
I think it's really just saying you don't want to step up volume too quickly. You know, we know that's where kind of injury can occur and maybe overreaching or overtraining can occur if people suddenly start doing too much too quickly, or if they go from, like, if everybody who's doing high intensity training now of one set to failure for 8 to 12 exercises once a week suddenly went and trained every day or did 10 sets of each exercise, then they would, and did it, frequently enough, they would be pretty unwell pretty quickly. I think certainly they do a lot of damage to their immune system and their sleep and their recovery and so forth. So
interesting. All right, so moving on to frequency. We're running out of time here, James. Significant, this is a long one. Significant hypertrophy can be achieved when training a muscle group as infrequently as once per week in lower to moderate volume protocols. This is music to everyone's ears in high intensity training. There does not seem to be a hypertrophic benefit to greater weekly per muscle training frequencies, provided set volume is equated. So that's what we talked about earlier, where, the minimum volume, if you wanted to do 10 sets per muscle group, is a lot in one session. But, you explain very well that the differences are very small in the volumes. And with that in mind, even one session a week is incredibly effective. And,
yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the key thing that most people are going to get most of their gains. We can go back to the 80-20 principle. Let's say 80% of gains are probably achieved by training once per week. And then anything more is achieved by training a second or a third time per week. The only caveat to all of that I'd say, which isn't discussed in the paper, and the reason for my training frequency being higher than once per week, is because I like the idea of kind of a glucose response, kind of emptying my muscles of glucose, and sort of metabolic response to training and sort of an overall fitness, rather than just necessarily strength or hypertrophy. So I think that we might be missing, and I think this is particularly important for the HIIT community whose adaptations might be greater than just muscle mass, that, there are health adaptations to perhaps training more frequently than once per week. So. Yeah,
I totally agree. And yeah, I mean, just to expand on that, give my side, I would definitely be training more frequently if I had the energy, for sure, right now. And I will be. I look forward to being able to do that. In fact, it's my intent to have at least one home workout and one studio workout once a week, because I like to be able to, as I've said before, do the workouts that our clients do and experience the difference between the two, because they are very different. And obviously it gives a different stress and stimulus to my body. But yeah, you're I absolutely agree in terms of obviously all the additional health benefits that come from potentially the higher frequency that you said as well. And then there's also adherence, right? There's an argument. I mean, I know. I remember the retention guru, Dr. Paul Bedford, saying on a rec call that I think once a week would suffice in terms of, when we talk about business here, producing greater retention over time for clients. And I don't know if there was a benefit to higher than once a week. There might have been. I can't remember if there was. But I do sometimes wonder if someone's training twice a week, they're getting obviously the health benefits, but also that buzz, that feeling you get. I mean, we all just feel amazing when we work out, right? In a kind of perverse kind of way, right? Yes. You feel the pump, you feel like you've been productive. It's just like a healthy habit. You feel like you've been a better human that day. I had a workout yesterday and I was having a really, really crappy day until that workout. And then suddenly my day was awesome. Right. So like there's that too, right? Like there's lots of benefits outside of, we're literally just talking about hypertrophy here, right? We're not talking about all this other stuff. So yeah, it's good to put into context.
I definitely think there's, without laboring the point, I definitely think there's psychological elements to training. And I laugh because I know a lot of people who do sort of boot camp training or CrossFit style training. And the evidence shows, our own research shows that they do it for kind of the social element, the competitive element, the collegiality. It's like being part of a sports team. And it's great. We've had the same thing from basketball, you and I, and I'm sure we see huge value in that. So if people get it from their version of strength training, that's fine. For me, I mean, I can remember hearing Jesse and Luke talking about meditation on a podcast a long time back, and they were saying, and I listen to podcasts about meditation, and I don't meditate, but when I go in the gym, I quite literally lock myself in a room with four walls relatively close, and I think about nothing other than my weights. And so for me, that's meditation. I'm not thinking about emptying my mind or breathing. I'm thinking about one single thing, and all the other stresses of work or family or everything else are gone. And so for me, it is meditation. It's, psychological health. So I think it's really important.
Your home gym, I can't remember where I saw it, but it looks amazing. I saw it somewhere, maybe Instagram, somewhere, Facebook, can't remember.
Luke might have posted pictures.
Yes. Did you train him in your home gym? Was that right? He did a virtual with you. That's it. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I was referring to. Yeah, it looks great though, mate. You've got a great little setup there.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Yeah, I could totally agree. And obviously we covered a bit of that in the mindful strength training podcast I did with Philip Shepherd and Andre. Awesome. Okay. Next bullet. It may be advantageous to spread out volume over more frequent sessions when performing high volume programs. We've covered this really, haven't we? A general recommendation would be to cap per session volume at 10 sets per muscle, and when applicable, increase weekly frequency to distribute additional volume. Yeah, I mean, you've just talked about
I can't imagine anybody listening to this podcast is doing 10 sets per muscle per workout and looking to add more volume.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. So yeah, I think if you're obsessed with hitting that quota, and we talked about why that might not be necessary, but if you are, then obviously feel free to distribute over multiple workouts. Rest intervals. Are you ready to move on to this? Yeah,
absolutely. Let's do it.
So rest intervals. As a general rule, rest periods should last at least 2 minutes when performing multi-joint exercises. What's the evidence to support that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, but bear in mind, this is for if you're repeating the same exercise. So I actually think this is a bit of a redundant point. And to be honest, when I made a few notes in preparation for this podcast, going back through the paper, I thought this is something we should really just slide over, because I can't imagine anybody here is doing multiple sets of a single exercise. And if they are, that's fine. The idea of 2 minutes, just to put it in context, is to allow ATP replenishment. So ATP is our energy source, is our main energy, or is the energy that we use, or our energy production mechanism, I should say. And we want to have that fully replenished for when we perform anaerobic exercise, and it shows that typically happens in upwards of 2 minutes. So I would say that should last at least 2 minutes, and that allows kind of a sufficient recovery to then repeat the exercise. I don't think that that's necessary for moving between exercises. And we talk a bit about superset training in the advanced training methods. So I would probably move on from the rest interval section if I'm totally honest.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Just before we do though, just so I understand those mechanisms better, if you do, let's say you do a set to failure, you're going to use a lot of the glucose in the muscle for glycolysis, and then be put through the Krebs cycle and then turned into ATP, right? So isn't that when you say it's being replenished after 2 minutes, aren't we talking, we're not talking about the glucose in the muscle to help with that process for the anaerobic?
Yeah, so there'll be a glucose release from other parts of the body that will allow glucose back into the bloodstream which will go to muscles to allow ATP replenishment in that way. So if we perform repeated high intensity bouts of exercise, so repeated anaerobic exercise, then any recovery interval we have, we'll rely on kind of other glucose stores to kind of replenish what we need. Within margin. I mean, it's talking about bioenergetics is very difficult because we never work solely on any one energy pathway. We never work purely aerobically or purely anaerobically or purely on ATP-PC or oxidative phosphorylation and so forth. So we would have a recovery to allow ATP replenishment, and that's really what this point is all about.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's what the false dichotomy that is used so much in exercise, right? As people talk about anaerobic, aerobic metabolism, and it is so much more complicated, as you just said there, how they work concurrently a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, just so for completeness, shorter rest periods, 60 to 90 seconds, can be employed for single joint and certain machine-based exercises. But obviously this is in the context of potentially doing the same exercise again, so we can just brush over. All right, go ahead.
It also says about set endpoint. I mean, to paint the bigger picture here, it says optimal rest interval duration would also be influenced by the set endpoint. So if somebody reaches true failure or goes beyond failure with advanced techniques, then the rest interval might be greater, or a recovery might be greater if performing multiple sets of the same exercise. And even to say, when I go into my garage and train, I might, if I do, let's say I did a workout the other day, I did pull-ups, and at the end of the set of pull-ups, when I, managed to grind out the last rep, I held at the top and I did a 30-second eccentric. At the end of that 30-second eccentric, which was after, a series of lower body exercises, and in fairness, to give a shout out to Devon from Discover Strength, who put me through that virtual workout, I was blowing. I wasn't ready to jump on the next exercise. I mean, I did it as fast as I could, but if somebody would have said to me, take 2 minutes and have a drink, I'd have been very, very happy to take 2 minutes. Whereas if I'd just gone to concentric failure, I'd have probably been happier to move on quicker. So, I think that the set endpoint can determine that, and the use of advanced overload techniques might also determine how quickly we move between exercises.
Yeah, you've got me thinking about clients wanting a drink of water during workouts, and I'm always thinking, yeah, like have a drink of water, but this is taking time out of your workout and having to wander across the studio. And I'm thinking I should just hold their drink or put it on the machine or something. So that, anyway, you just got me thinking about that. Yeah. I'm always thinking about how I can make the workouts more efficient. All right. So exercise selection. Hypertrophy-oriented resistance training programs should include a variety of exercises that work muscles in different planes and angles of pull to ensure complete stimulation of the musculature. This is another one which we've spoken about before. I think we talked about it in the series with Luke that we did on program design. But maybe I forget what we talked about, but I'm really skeptical about this one. So why do you think that's important?
Yeah, so the main study that's shown this is a study by Fonseca et al., and they looked at growth of the quadriceps. The quadriceps obviously having the rec fem, the vastus medialis, lateralis, and intermedialis, and they found greater sort of growth across all the muscles in a group that use different quadricep exercises. So they did a deadlift, I think a lunge, a squat, and a knee extension, compared to a group that did effectively just 4 sets of deadlift. And I think I actually think this is quite nice for the HIIT guys, because it kind of says, instead of doing the same exercise over and over again, have a bit of variety. Do a wall sit and do a split squat and do a knee extension and do a leg press, and you can kind of have those extra exercises in there to add that variety and kind of target the muscle in different directions or from different angles and so forth. Whether you get the same adaptation in a single muscle is to be seen. And the evidence around this kind of says that there was a study that compared a seated leg curl to a prone leg curl. So a prone leg curl would be with the hips much straighter, so that the muscle essentially shorter over the hips, and then lengthening and shortening only over the knee, compared to a seated leg curl where the hamstring muscle is lengthened over the hips, and then it lengthens at the knee and shortens at the knee. And they found greater growth in the seated leg curl compared to the prone leg curl. And one of the things that they sort of said is that training a muscle at longer lengths, at greater lengths, might stimulate greater adaptation compared to at shorter lengths. And this actually goes back to kind of or ties into something that Arthur said a long time back. And the example I gave about the triceps before was that if I extend my arm, my triceps are now extended here, so they're lengthened here, and I now lengthen them, or I now shorten them and lengthen them here. That might be a greater tricep exercise than if I have them tucked down by my side to do a tricep extension. So, and this is, there isn't the data around the biceps or the triceps or so forth, but Arthur always said that this is why a pull-up exercise will beat a bicep curl, because we shorten the biceps here and then lengthen the biceps over the shoulder, while we shorten the biceps at the elbow and then lengthen the biceps at the elbow. Does that make sense?
It does. It's fascinating. Hadn't even thought about that before. Yeah.
And I think this is where, and again, this comes back to, of course, volume and number of sets, because and the way you stimulate growth in a muscle, because if 2 sets of pull-ups might be equivalent to 5 sets of bicep curls, because of the way the muscle's contracting as a biaxial muscle contracting over 2 joints. But of course, these studies haven't been done, and most studies comparing set volume have typically looked at single joint movements like a bicep curl or a knee extension and so forth. So I think that, again, once we get into the bigger picture, we can say, well, are any 2 exercises the same? Potentially not.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And your point there, I mean, that was awesome. But just going back, your point there about how, multiple exercises working on muscle groups might look like they probably have a positive impact on muscle growth. I know that right as you were saying that, Luke Carlson is on his master step mill punching the air, right? Because that is something I sure would I mean, he knows that already, I'm sure, but I think that's the kind of thing he'd like to hear. Right. I could be wrong, Luke. Correct me if I'm wrong, if you didn't have that reaction. Right. So where are we? James? We were on exercise selection. Okay,
we're on exercise selection, and there's another point that I don't know if you've got this bit highlighted about free weight exercises.
Can I just ask you one more thing before that? I just want to ask about, just staying on this bullet about planes and angles. So you gave a good example there about the muscles of the thigh. I'm just curious where else we can talk about this. Could we talk about this in the context of maybe the muscles of the trunk? So maybe doing a variety of different exercises that stimulate muscles of the trunk, like sit-ups, planks, obviously lumbar extension. You're going to get potentially more benefit utilizing more variety there.
Yeah, I actually think the trunk is a great example, but not just because of the movements that we perform, but because of the different functions that we perform. So one of the key functions, of course, of the trunk is not necessarily dynamic, it's stabilization. So performing a plank exercise might be a key exercise for our trunk muscles because we're looking to stabilize our trunk, we're stabilizing the muscles around the spine and prevent movement, rather than a dynamic exercise, which is to perform movement. So we might do sit-ups or crunches or twists or side bends or Roman chair to move in every direction. I mean, that covers our flexion or angled flexion or lateral flexion or rotation and our extension. But actually, a lot of the time, if I pick up two heavy shopping bags and one is particularly heavier than the other, then actually at that point, the purpose of my trunk is not to perform flexion, lateral flexion, is to perform stabilization and allow me to keep my shoulders and my hips level, even though the weight is pulling me in one direction. So I think that's a great example that multiple exercises for a body part or for an anatomical region can be really beneficial, not just from a growth perspective, but from a performance perspective.
You've just made me cancel grocery home delivery now, James, because I'm going to start going back to carrying my groceries back from the shop, which I used to do as part of my
you said
farmer's
you can
walk.
sprint there in like 20 seconds or something, can't you?
That's, it's embarrassing that you bring that up, but yes, I can. It's actually just purely a time efficiency life hack thing, getting the food shop delivered, And just for everyone listening, during COVID, I didn't do it as much because obviously those who needed it more needed it. So I did some good deed there, James. I didn't use the service.
Very good.
Just genuine. I'm not joking. I did actually do that. But that's no big deal. So anyway, moving on, I'm going to start carrying my groceries. Also, if you're not watching this on YouTube, you've got to watch it on YouTube, because not only does James have a really impressive physique, but he's basically demonstrating all of the different movements when he's talking about stuff that's hard to explain in just words. So go over to YouTube if you need a better understanding of some of these things. Okay, so right, we're on point number 2. We're going to get to that freeway bit in a bit. Programming should employ a combination of multi and single joint exercises to maximize whole muscle development. Where applicable, focus on employing exercises that work muscles at long lengths. You've done that already, haven't you? You talked about that. Yeah. Okay. Freeway exercises. So freeway exercises with complex movement patterns should be performed regularly to reinforce motor skills. Alternatively, less complex exercises can be rotated more liberally for variety. Fascinating stuff. I thought that was. But do you have a point you want to make about that? Elaborate on it.
Yeah. So I mean, this is quite interesting. So the comment was freeway exercises with complex movement patterns should be performed regularly to reinforce motor skills. And the argument here is that if you stop performing a freeway exercise, and the examples given were squats, rows, and bench presses. Now, bear in mind, they're all arguably complex, but let's say let's use a squat, for example, which is the most complex of those exercises because of the spinal stabilization, because of what's happening in the upper body, as well as the lower body. If you stop performing squats for any length of time, then you will, when you return to performing squats, you will go through like let's call it a relearning phase. Yeah, a biomechanical or relearning of the biomechanical movement and retraining of the muscles to kind of work in synchrony to perform that exercise. And so the argument put forward was that, well, because most people will at some point perform something like squats, they should carry on performing squats. Now, my argument against this was, well, why do you need to perform squats? You don't need to perform squats to induce hypertrophy. You can perform leg presses, or you can perform split squats, or you can perform other exercises. So I don't think it's fair to say that sticking with the squat example, that squats should be performed regularly to reinforce motor skills. If you're going to go back to squats occasionally, then the maintenance of performing squats is probably beneficial. But on the off chance, and Discover Strength is a prime example, so forgive me for using this repeated example. And in fact, high intensity training is probably a great example because most people don't perform a back squat exercise. So it would be wrong for a Discover Strength client or a high intensity training client of anywhere to go in and say, I should be performing back squats because this paper says, because they would say, well, you're never going to do it with us. So unless you're going to go and do it elsewhere, and therefore you need to practice the skill of it, then you don't need to do it. And the reason that's important, to put it in context, is that skills that have a higher complexity to them, a greater motor schema, a greater kind of skill element, are less likely to stimulate growth in the early stages, because our body spends so long trying to learn the exercise and recruit the muscle fibers to do the exercise before we can eventually get to a growth phase. So let's say, for example, a back squat compared to a knee extension and a leg curl. Well, a knee extension and a leg curl are so simple in their movement that you cannot help but contract the quadriceps for the knee extension and the leg curl for the hamstrings. And so you almost, from the outset of performing that exercise, will stimulate hypertrophy. Whereas a back squat, you will spend time getting stronger, but only through the neurological adaptation. And then it will take time for hypertrophy to kind of occur. So I think that it's a fair argument to say you should perform it regularly to maintain it. And again, if we think about the population group for which this makes reference to, which is typically bodybuilders who do a large variety of exercises and a high volume of exercises, it probably is fair to say that even when they're not focused on squats, they should probably still do some squats once a week just to maintain that skill element. For the rest of us, I don't think there's, I think it's a little bit redundant, if I'm honest.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Okay, I just want to read this again myself, see if I got anything more I want to ask you on it. Yeah, okay. That's interesting. All right. So attention must be given to applied anatomical and biomechanical considerations so that, so I'm trying to read this on a different screen. Exercise selection is not simply a collection of diverse exercises, but rather a cohesive, integrated strategy designed to target the entire musculature. So whole body workouts, basically.
Yeah, and really what they're saying is you don't just, if I say, oh, well, you should do 2 different bicep exercises, and you did dumbbell bicep curl, standing dumbbell bicep curl, and standing barbell bicep curl, that's not training 2 different bicep exercises. That's training the same bicep exercise in 2 different ways. Whereas if you said, okay, I'm going to do incline dumbbell hammer curl and supinated chin-ups, then those would now be 2 different exercises that train the biceps in different ways with different kind of biomechanical stresses. So I think it's just clarity over, don't just add variety for the sake of variety, have some thought to the strategy of the variety of exercises.
I love it. Adjusting workout B, dumbbell curl to hammer grip. There you go. Okay, excellent. Yeah, so I get an extra inch of my bicep, right, James? That's what you're saying. Yeah. Okay. So
the conditions apply.
I suck at bicep curls. So unless someone's shouting at me or training me, I just find them so hard to get to muscle failure. So hard. All right. Novice lifters. So we're moving on to set endpoint now. Just aware of time, James. It's probably, we try and get through this in 10 minutes. Is that okay?
Lawrence, let's call an audible on this. Let's do set endpoint in a different podcast.
Ooh.
Because I think it's quite interesting in context of this paper. But there's also a couple of review papers that came out recently that suggest that there isn't a need to train to muscular failure. And I've written kind of a response to that, which is in review right now. So why don't we schedule another podcast as a follow-up to simply talk about failure, not failure, set endpoint? How does that work?
That is amazing. Yeah, I'd love to do that.
And then we can definitely get through advanced training methods, concurrent training, and periodization in the next 10 minutes.
But say that again, sorry.
And then we can definitely cover the others in the next 10 minutes. Advanced training methods.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have that in front of me. That's not in the consensus recommendation? Or have I not printed that bit?
Advanced training methods.
Hang on. It's not in table 1. I'm looking at table 1. It's just references after that, like 10 pages of references. So unless we're going backwards.
So you didn't read the whole paper, you just skipped to the table.
Yes. Oh, of course. Wait, did you think I was reading the whole thing as we were going through it?
Okay. In that case, let me summarize the other variables that are discussed.
Thank you.
Okay. So we talk about advanced training methods, and that was the section that I mentioned at the start. That was the section that I wrote. And I've got it right in front of me, so I'll sort of skip to where it is. If I can find it, bear with me. I make sure that I read it verbatim if I read anything directly.
So I'm trying to find it too.
So advanced training methods, I think, starts on page 15, and the consensus statement is on page 18. So I said the present body of literature does not empirically support the use of advanced training methods for enhancing hypertrophic adaptations. So really, as you read through this section, one of the key things you'll find is there simply is not enough research with large enough sample sizes to identify whether doing things like drop sets or forced repetitions or breakdown or pre or post exhaustion is beneficial for hypertrophy, for increases in muscle size. And like I said, a lot of that is simply down to not enough research and not large enough sample sizes. But the consensus statement is fair. The present body of literature doesn't support it. Although there is evidence to support the necessity for eccentric muscles within resistance training programs, it is unclear as to whether hypertrophy can be enhanced by performing eccentric overload. So one of the things that we talk about in here is the difference between concentric and eccentric muscle actions. And it certainly appears that eccentric muscle actions are important for muscle growth. So there should be at least a focus on performing an eccentric muscle action. We don't just lift the weight and drop it, or raise the weight and lower it without being under control and so forth. But again, it's not really clear whether there's a benefit to eccentric overload. One of the things that I would say is there is no benefit to, or there's no detrimental effects to not performing advanced training methods. So, for example, drop sets, breakdown sets, so forth, have never shown lesser increases in hypertrophy or lesser increases in strength. So with that in mind, what I would typically say is absolutely go ahead and use them, and they can be great to make sure we reach kind of a high level of effort. But don't do them with the thought process that they're essential for kind of optimizing growth. If that makes sense.
It does, absolutely. Did you have a couple other points you wanted to finish on as well? Yeah.
There's a couple of points around that. So one of the things that we said is that drop sets can be a great way to get higher volume in. And in fact, in the workout that I did with Devon the other day, I did rest pause on the chest press. And for the first time in a long time, I had soreness in my chest. So a huge shout out to Devon for that. But 20-second rest and then repeat more reps, and 20-second rest and then repeat more reps. So, rest pause is obviously different from drop sets, but I guess you can get the same adaptation by dropping the weight, repeating, dropping the weight, repeating, and so forth. So you can get a higher volume in by doing that, should there be a need for a higher volume. Pre-exhaustion can be great from a health perspective, and it was Roger Schwab who first sort of spoke to me about this, and I think he's absolutely right. I mean, this guy is a genius in the strength training area, and in fact, I'm going to call you out and say, I don't think you've ever had Roger on your podcast, have you?
I have, but it was way back.
Okay, yeah. You should get him on again, just because he's just also the nicest guy on the planet.
He is.
But he once sort of said to me, when you get very strong, when you're pressing or squatting or doing pull downs with a very, very heavy load, naturally the stress is not just on the muscular system, it's on the joint system as well. So if you're, say, doing a bench press with, 140 kilos, that's 300 pounds, then you are naturally putting that kind of stress through your shoulders and through your elbows to some extent as well, and your wrists. Whereas if you do a pre-exhaust, say do a pec fly or a dumbbell fly, then when you come to the press, the amount you can press will be a lot less. And therefore, you're still stimulating the muscle in the same way because it's just already fatigued, but the stress on the joints is a lot less. I can't think of a more logical approach to pre-exhaustion than that. It makes perfect sense from a health perspective. Unfortunately, I don't do any exercises with sufficient weight to necessitate pre-exhaustion, but I think it's a great argument for those people that are. So, so I think that there's some argument around the use of it, and then pre-exhaustion and superset training, I think, can be great from a time-saving perspective. And I know obviously Discover Strength and a lot of high intensity training people use pre-exhaustion and also move between exercises pretty quickly. So again, there's no evidence to say that it's not, producing good adaptations or producing lesser adaptations. So
yeah, James, the exceptional learning experience we're having today. I'm learning so much. It's just been awesome, and excited to schedule that other podcast on air. Do you need to train to failure? That would be the title of the next podcast for sure, based on what you said there. So that's going to be fun.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Any sort of parting thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, so there was a couple of other things within it, and I'll focus on one of those. One was concurrent training, and James Steele wrote this section, and I want to talk about it because I presented on it at the virtual rec during lockdown, and I talked about something called an interference effect for hypertrophy. And one of the things that I said is that there's a lesser interference effect in things like cyclists because of impact compared to an interference effect in runners where there is impact. The interference effect essentially says that if you're doing cardiovascular training, it might impact or it might interfere with the muscle growth adaptations. Now, in fact, not long after that conference presentation, a paper came out as a meta-analysis that was really nicely put together. And in fact, James Steele and I looked at a lot of the data from it, and James wrote this section. And it would be fair to say that there isn't actually much evidence now to equivocally say that there is an interference effect for hypertrophy. So I think that actually people going away and doing cardio, whether that's rowing or running or cycling or swimming, they probably shouldn't be too fearful that will have a big effect on their muscle growth responses from strength training. The caveat, of course, to that being, if you are doing so much cardio training that you're inhibiting your adaptive energy, then you probably are not, like if you're running every day and then lifting weights on one of those days, your body is probably in quite a state of fatigue, and therefore you can't direct as much energy to muscle growth. So I think that's probably relatively important. And the other caveat around all of that is that if cardiovascular training is performed in such a way that it's so high in duration, so long in duration, and so low in intensity, then that again might be impacting muscle growth adaptations because of the kind of the energy required to adapt. So if somebody runs a marathon 3 times a week, again, that would arguably be low effort, long duration, then that might negatively impact muscle growth compared to, say, somebody doing sprints 3 times a week, which of course sprints could potentially be positive for hypertrophy anyway. So that might be kind of stimulating the same pathway.
Yeah, understood. That's so interesting. One just final point on that. So just to be clear, like if someone's like an elite athlete, like a professional soccer player or basketball player or something like that, they've got to be really careful strength training in season, right? Because of the argument you just gave in terms of too much can be needing all of that adaptive energy for the sport, right? And I know that Doug and John made the case in Body by Science. Was it Blair they put through that test? I think he told me he was the case. I could be getting this wrong. The case study where he was playing ice hockey at high level, and they trained him off season, but then in season they found, again, sorry, apologies guys if I'm getting this wrong, but in season they could barely train him, if at all, because he just simply could not could not produce strength gains or muscle growth gains. So he would basically lose muscle because it was just too much, right?
Yeah, and
Overtrained.
I think that's probably true of a lot of athletes, that they lose muscle or lose weight during a season, especially in athletes like basketball players where they're playing multiple times a week. Football players, it might be easier. American football players, it might be easier where they're playing typically once a week, and they can afford to have other training sessions within there. And obviously, I can imagine that the level of kind of training on the field probably drops off or changes in its nature during the season to allow for that recovery. But yeah, certainly I can't imagine that during a season you'd get the same adaptive response as you would during an off season, and hence the importance of an off season, and really why it should never be called an off season. It's just a transition phase.
Yeah, well said. Love it. Awesome, James. Like, honestly, best podcast ever. Which I should never say because it's like an insult to everyone who's previously featured on the podcast, but I just love this podcast so much. And any other parting thoughts? Or
no, I really think, one of the key things that I always say about this kind of paper is I know that it goes in the face of a lot of what people think that I think, and I know it probably challenges a lot of what they think. But I would encourage them to read it with an open mind, and I would encourage them to or to read it with a critical mind. The literature is there. This paper is very, very good at saying there isn't enough evidence to say this. And when there isn't enough evidence, that means that we can really fall into whichever pathway we want, and we can choose it as long as we choose it with a rationale. Where there is sufficient evidence, that evidence is presented. So, and you reach a point where you can argue against research for so long, but eventually you just become the kind of the cynic. Interestingly, when the paper was first completed, there was a couple of points that I've discussed here that I kind of disagreed with. And I sat back and thought, I could save face to the high intensity community and I could ask to be withdrawn from this paper. And therefore I would never be associated with the 10 sets or the free weights or whatever else it might be. But if I did that, I would probably then almost be inclined to comment on the paper anyway. And I would then sound like an outsider just having a bitch about a paper that I wasn't involved in. Whereas being involved in the paper was far, far more productive and allowed me to have these conversations with Stu and with Brad and with Eric, and allowed us to kind of have this back and forth as academics and produce something that we can allow the people to read. That's an open access journal, so anybody can go and read it. So
how would you do that? I'm picturing like a Zoom call with all of you on it, but surely that's not productive. It's
no, it was all done via email. It was all done via email.
Oh, email, really?
Yeah. So it was comments in the paper, and then it was email, and yeah, we
That would drive me mad. Your inbox must have been just insane.
Yeah, I think that. Well, yeah, but I think that when you have something like this to say, you now start to choose your words, and you become very clear in what you want to say. So you don't put forward the argument over 10 different emails. You put forward the argument once over an email, and then everybody responds, and then you decide whether you feel strongly enough to bite back or whether you kind of go, okay.
Who's the most short on email out of everyone on the paper?
Yeah. So, but it was a great process, and it's a fantastic paper. And like I said, kudos to Brad for this paper. It's and of course the other co-authors. I think it's a great paper. I do think that it's worth restipulating. This is the optimization of hypertrophy, which might not be in everybody's interests, or people might not admit to it being in their interests.
That's probably more accurate.
Yeah.
Awesome, James. Thank you again for your time today. Really appreciate it. And for everyone listening or watching, to find the blog post for this episode and download a free PDF to help you attract great personal trainers to your strength training business, please go to highintensitybusiness.com, search for episode 350. And until next time, thank you very much for listening. This episode is brought to you by ARX. You want to be a successful strength training studio owner. The problem is you aren't able to deliver the safest, most efficient, and effective workouts, making it harder for you to attract and retain clients, which makes you feel frustrated. I understand that it can be difficult to differentiate your business without the right tools. ARX's breakthrough adaptive resistance technology uses patented motorized resistance and computer software to give you and your clients the perfect workout every single time. BioFit founder John Zarbok says that ARX is clearly the superior tool to deliver the exercise stimulus. My clients are seeing insane improvements in weeks, not months. I could not fathom running my business without ARX. So here's how you get started. Number 1, go to arxfit.com/HOB to get $500 off your ARX machines. Number 2, book a call with the ARX sales team. And number 3, learn how ARX can help you grow your strength training business. Go to arxfit.com/HOB so you can stop struggling to attract and retain clients and start to grow your strength training business with confidence.